You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. The Inn by Doomsday Falls is a story by Allison V. Harding, first published in the November 1947 edition of Weird Tales. A haunted inn, a cursed falls, and an evil being who should have been but dust in a grave centuries ago. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. Share them in the comments below. And without further ado, The Inn by Doomsday Falls by Allison V. Harding. 1. Miss Ammon stopped worrying her grapefruit salad with the fork abruptly and rolled her eyes heavenward. There are stories, you know. She was one of those talky, elderly women that no summer resort inn is ever without. When Miss Ammon's returned to earth again, Peggy murmured politely, "What stories?" Why she should be polite, I don't know. After all, it was our table. But these elderly spinsters, it's so jolly to chat with people, isn't it? Get acquainted. Peggy's like that. One of the reasons why I married her. There are others, as you can see. Well, my dears, the spinster went on, batting her eyes at me as though she weren't old enough to be my grandmother. Some do say this inn is haunted. I don't put too much credence in these local ghost stories, of course. Every community has an old house that people claim is haunted. But I've heard about this place from several sources. Her eyes begged us to beg her to go on. Well, I'd prefer a ghost to some of the customers. Miss Ammons let out a high-pitched titter. You are so droll, Mr. Holland. What are these stories? Peggy asked. Needing no more than that, Miss Ammons took a breath. I first heard about it last year. You know, I've been up here before. Well, anyway, the cab driver who brought me out from the station, I think he was a little under the weather. He sang halfway out, and the other half he started telling me about the falls. Miss Ammons gestured towards the waterfall which could be heard and seen from the dining veranda. To me, it was one of the nicest features of Philip's Inn. The inn itself stood in a low, woodsy glen, sunlight dappled during the day, dark and cool at night. To the west, the land ran upward steeply, and from the height, precipitous for this section of the country, a waterfall rushed and tumbled down into the small stream that ran past the inn. There was a lake, shadowed and deep above the falls, large enough for canoeing and boating, and this was one of the facilities provided by the Phillips establishment. I remember when one of the waitresses, local talent, told me the name Doomsday Falls, I felt a spark of interest. But when I asked her if it had any particular meaning, she merely shrugged and turned away. But now it seemed my mild curiosity was to be satisfied, and I was afraid at great length. Miss Ammons prattled on, and my mind began to wander to other things. I heard the words Iroquois Indians and war canoes, over the falls, all killed, but I'd taken my share of beatings from old maids at resorts. Although this was my vacation, my thoughts were concerned with my architectural business back in the city, left for 3 weeks in the capable hands of my assistant. Back in our room, Peggy filled me in somewhat as she stood in front of the mirror and combed her smooth, raven-black hair into a page boy. It seemed that warring bands of Indians had fought on the lake above the inn long years ago, and on one occasion, according to the legends, the chief's canoe had been ambushed through the treachery of one of his braves. Canoe and warriors had been shunted into the fast-running end of the lake where the light vessel had been sucked into the vortex of water and hurled over the falls, smashing its occupants to death on the rocks below. Miss Ammon says one of the Indians still shows up once in a while. Peggy finished her tale dramatically. That's fine, I replied. Maybe we could trade some of your costume jewelry for a few thousand acres of land. Peggy pouted, and I thought no more about it. Although one goes to a place like Philip's Inn for relaxation, after a while there is a certain routine that catches up with you. Maybe it's habit, because so much of our lives are concerned with routine. Anyway, our days became pretty formularized after the first few it took to find out what's where and when. After breakfast, Peggy and I usually played some tennis or badminton. Then in the afternoon, I liked to catch a little nap, and Peggy took on a magazine or a bestseller down in the library. The rest of the afternoon we killed off at the archery range, or perhaps some more tennis, if it was raining, a few rubbers of bridge. In the evening, I developed the habit of taking the path that led upland, paralleling the course of the stream, climbing almost straight up, it seemed to me, almost as precipitously as Doomsday Falls itself. Then the trail led along the shores of the lake that spread out from a narrow funnel just above the falls to form an oblong of water for some several miles. Peggy had taken the first few after-dinner walks with me, but I was strictly on my own ever since she almost stepped on something that slithered across the path. I tried to explain that it was only a harmless garter snake, but you know how girls are. This night I was hiking alone. We'd won a particularly pleasant rubber from the Stevensons, another young couple staying at the inn, and to celebrate our revenge for a beating they'd given us a few days earlier, I'd had more than my share of an extraordinarily fine liquor at dinner. I realized this as I completed the climb up to the path bordering the lake and winding in and out of trees just at its edge. As I stood and surveyed the limpid purple waters, I regretted my last 2 glasses of the strong and heady Cointreau. I must admit that my surroundings were swimming a bit before my eyes. It was like scenery seen through shimmering heat waves. I walked rapidly along the path, hoping to clear my head, with my eyes cast downward, watching the uneven trail so I wouldn't trip, my arms working at my sides. I must have covered more ground than I had intended, for when I paused to catch some much-needed breath, I was in a totally unfamiliar part of the lakefront. I realized I'd come around a little bend, for between me and the familiar oak trees that signaled the falls and the glen was a promontory nudging the lake with a scrubby finger of rock. After I'd admired the pleasing twilight scene, I was about to start back when a small sound caught my attention. It was simply a faint splashing noise. I looked quickly up towards the unfamiliar upper reaches of the lake, and there, coming down the near shore, was a canoe. Although I was too far away, and my eyes still too fuddled to see the figure clearly, I could tell from the bright painted sides that it was one of the Philip's Inn craft. Then the vessel glided into a path of light thrown from the westward across the serene water, and the pounding of my heart was now more due to surprise than the exertion of my brisk walk. For I could see, even at this distance, the banded headdress and the unmistakable outline of 2 feathers. Instinctively, I crouched down beside a bush. I don't know why exactly. Slowly propelled by strong, sure strokes, the birch bark glided towards me until I could see the brown, moulded body of the paddler kneeling amidships. I believe I became quite frightened then and confused. It was the face, perhaps, that contributed, although even as I was perturbed, I was still cursing myself for too much liquor. The Indian, for so he was grim-visaged, and the dabs of bright war paint accentuated the cruelty of his face. I rose and turned, my only thought then to get back down the path, to reach Philip's Inn as soon as possible, end this outre nightmare, get into bed with an ice pack and something that would make me sleep off the unpleasant result of my overindulgence. As I got up, I must have made a crashing noise in the bushes, because I saw, even as I turned, the figure in the canoe swing his head sharply in my direction. He was abreast of me now, although some dozens of feet out on the lake, but his motions were swift and sure. Even as my faltering legs found the path and broke into a run, I saw, looking back over my shoulder, the savage reach into the depths of the canoe and come up with a bow, and then a long feather-tipped arrow. I ran desperately, headlong, and when I saw him bend the bow with his mighty arm muscles, I dove to the ground. There was a twanging sound, and something plucked at my coat. I looked in horror at the shaft that had pierced my pocket and spent itself in the ground on which I was lying. I twisted away, wrenching at the arrow feverishly with both hands, and then I was on my feet and running again. I ran as fast and hard and long as I could. Finally there was the sound of the falls. I stopped then, a little ashamed of myself. The run had cleared my head, and all of a sudden I felt very foolish. I looked behind me, and of course there was nothing. I walked into the grounds of the inn proper and hurried inside, hoping no one would notice my dishevelled appearance. I found Peggy upstairs in our room reading. "I'm glad to see you," she grinned at me. "You know, I was almost worried. Johnny, I think you had a little too much. Hey, what have you been doing? Rolling on the ground?" I smiled self-consciously. I guess I fell. She helped me get to bed, but not before I purposely brought up something that was bothering me. "Peg, look at this." I showed her my coat and the tear. "You know, I just can't figure out how in the world—" "Silly," she said with wifely knowingness. "That must have been when you tripped and fell down. You ran a branch through your pocket. Good thing you didn't put your eye out up there," she shuddered, "or get bitten by one of those awful snakes." "Guess you're right," I mumbled and fell into bed. The next morning was for me a dull headache and a thick taste in my mouth. I was alone. A look at my watch showed it was 9:45. Peggy must have gone down for breakfast some time ago. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to get up ambition enough to dress. The events of the previous evening came into focus slowly and blended into fragments of near-forgotten dreams I'd had when I finally got to sleep. I crossed to the clothes closet and rummaged till I found the coat I'd been wearing. Yes, here it was with the rent in the cloth. I took it, hanger and all, over to the window and scrutinized it. I felt in the pocket on that side. There was my usual assortment of junk. A key case, a pipe, a small pocket knife. I was about to lay the suit coat aside, go into the bathroom and shave, and tell myself sternly in the mirror, "Johnny boy, you sure had too much last night," when I pricked a finger on something. It was a sliver of wood about an inch long, and my early morning mind tried to catch up with the implications. It was definitely not a piece of dark brown live twig wood or bark, the end of some branch that might have caught my coat as I fell, for this was smooth, polished, and light-coloured on the unbroken side, like a splinter from an arrow. But there was nothing ancient about the wood. In fact, it may have come from one of the arrows on the inn archery range. I went down to the nearly empty dining room, took my coffee black and fast. I was trying to pull the pieces together, when a voice at my elbow made me jump. It was Miss Emmons, burbling as usual. She flounced into a seat opposite me, draping some half-finished knitting on her side of the table. "Your wife is a Cointreau widow," she needled. "So it serves me right," I told myself. People had noticed last night. Anyway, she told me to tell you she'd gone horseback riding. I nodded absently. "Well," pursued Miss Emmons, unwilling to allow a pause, "and have you seen our ghost yet?" My head came up at that. Just what is this tale? The spinster might have said, "You weren't listening when I told you and your wife yesterday." But instead she plunged ahead enthusiastically. This time I paid attention. An Iroquois tribe, which at one time inhabited the central part of the state, was divided into several factions. Among these there were two, the Senecas and the Mohawks, Miss Emmons thought the story went, who bitterly contested the lake above and the surrounding land. Each claimed his people had prior rights. They had massacred each other down to the last man, or perhaps not quite. Miss Emmons paused for dramatic effect. She took a deep, delicious breath, and continued. No other tribes would ever move in. A warrior guarded this territory forever, indestructible to the weapons of other Indians, and by this whole part of the land was left deserted. Isn't that romantic? The elderly lady cooed. And you know, Mr. Holland, They say he shows up every now and then by the lake, by the falls, or even here around the inn itself." Just then another elderly woman passed the table, but she had a considerably kinder face than Miss Emmons. The two exchanged pleasantries. The other lady looked vaguely familiar. "That's Mrs. Talmadge," my companion supplied in hushed tones. "She's co-owner, and I'm afraid she isn't doing as well here as she should. Believe it or not, I know it's silly to say this, but the legend of the ghostly Indian doesn't seem to help business much. They told me that at the station." Miss Ammons leaned forward confidentially. "And I have an idea that Mr. Falk, he's the fat one." Miss Ammons blew air into her cheeks and described huge outward circles over her already large middle. "Well, he's the other co-owner, and I think he wants to buy Mrs. Talmadge out." To me, Mrs. Talmadge was just a face at one of the tables at meal-times, but I had noticed Falk. He was a big man, dressed everlastingly in white ducks and a blue coat. He was, to put it truthfully, repulsively obese, with a fleshy white face totally devoid of expression. People took their complaints to Mrs. Talmadge, but Falk was always around when the time came to settle up bills. I disliked him without reason, the way you do some people, instinctively. "Just a bookkeeper here," Miss Emmons was going on. "He started out working for her, mind you, quite some years back. He still was when I first came here, and then, my dear, the next summer I found he was part owner, and recently, so I understand, he owns half the entire business." "If you'll excuse me," I interrupted, getting up. "I'm supposed to meet someone over by the tennis courts." Miss Ammons wasn't insulted. She waved goodbye gaily. Peggy and I reunioned late that morning by the pool. "There you are," she called, coming up to me in riding habit. It was a phrase I didn't like anyway. I was still grouchy. Later on, I entered half-heartedly into a tennis foursome, but wasn't even sorry when we absorbed a thumping beating and I could quit. I gave Peggy's hand a reassuring squeeze when she looked at me with mock sternness and said, "I'll supervise your evening meal, young man." Then I left. I found old Mrs. Talmadge out on the back lawn. Some of the veterans were playing croquet, and she was watching. I sat down beside her and received a smile that was half professional and half kindly. It made me feel like a heel to come out abruptly and say, "Mrs. Talmadge, what about this Indian ghost that haunts the place?" I felt more like a heel when the elderly innkeeper turned the colour of my newest starched shirt. I thought for a moment she was going to faint, but she got hold of herself, took a tiny sighing breath, and asked, "Have you seen him?" I tried then to steer the conversation into a happy course, saying that I'd heard the legend but considered the whole thing a joke. It was as though my money was at stake, I realized suddenly, instead of Mrs. Talmadge's. Her replies were half-hearted. I knew as I left her that she was a very frightened woman. I cursed myself. It seemed a brutal way of ascertaining my own ability to conjure up hallucinations, especially after too much liquor. Again I crossed paths with Miss Emmons. This time she seemed even more enthusiastic than usual. She wore walking shoes and was swinging a stick. I dodged the inevitable invitation. "Oh, you young people," she effervesced. "You just don't walk enough, any of you. I asked your pretty wife and she begged off. Said she'd been up with you once and seen a snake. Imagine that. Frightened off by a little snake. Well, I shall do my hiking alone, it seems." And she strode off with surprising agility for one of her years. The second part of my program was as obvious as the first. So that evening after supper, supervised carefully by an impish Peggy, I slipped down into a chair next to Mr. Falk in a deserted corner on the back terrace. I tried the weather, politics, but he showed a remarkable lack of interest and conversational ability. When I tried, "How about this ghost, Mr. Falk? So many people have mentioned it to me, I'm kind of interested," his little pig eyes flickered, and for the first time he looked at me squarely. "There is a legend," he intoned slowly. "There also seem to be a lot of people around who claim that this Indian ghost has been seen," I egged him on. "Yes," admitted Falk. "He's a rather bloodthirsty savage, too." Is there any truth to the story?" Falk shrugged his massive shoulders. "We don't believe in ghosts these days, do we? There have been a few strange occurrences, though, particularly one unfortunate episode a year or so ago. A man of all work around the place here was found in a rather strange condition. Death is always strange, perhaps you will say, but he was... Well, we don't discuss it here, but the authorities claimed he might have received his unusual injury by falling against a sharp rock." There was silence then, as the wind blowing from off the lake over the falls and down through the glen took with it his words, leaving only chill afterthoughts. "It was nearly pitch black, I think, when I first heard it. If Falk had noticed before me, he gave no sign. I thought at first it was an animal. I'm not very familiar with the country, but the sound was high and piercing, despite the fact that it seemed to emanate from some distance lakeward. Half cogitating Falk's words and half listening, I continued to sit there on the terrace, but the sound in the night gradually took more of my attention. Yes, it was distinctly louder than a moment ago, coming nearer, and just as I spoke to the man next to me, I came to a jolting conclusion that the sound was not some creature of the night, but a human voice screaming far away in mortal terror. Falk said he'd heard it too. It was too dark now to see the expression on his face, but suddenly the mountain of him rose from his chair. He looked into the night, his face towards the cascading falls and the beyond from whence the noise was coming. Other guests had noticed now, and they stopped whatever they were doing. It was strange to stand there and hear this sound coming from above the falls, out beyond, where the lake ran under the black skies. Whatever it was, whomever it was, they were coming closer, and yet we stood, I remember now as the phrase goes, rooted to the spot. It wasn't until in the last paroxysms of terror that the scream seemed to take definite form, and the word help floated down on the wind to us, that some of us took flashlights and started hurriedly up the path to the falls. It was on my way through the murmuring glen that I recalled suddenly I hadn't seen the usually hearty-eating Miss Emmons at supper, nor had I spotted her since she left for her walk. There was Falk and a young fellow whose name I think was Smythe, then a man who did odd jobs around the inn, and somebody else. We redoubled our efforts and made short work of the path until we'd reached the waterfall level. We started along the lakefront. Smythe and I outdistanced the others slightly. It was Smythe who saw her first, but I was right on his heels. We stood and played our flashlights down on her. It was Miss Emmons. I remember I had a silly, trivial thought. I was a little conscience-stricken that I had sneered once or twice at the spinster's talkativeness, for now she would do no more talking. She had been running, you could see that by the deep footmarks in the path. Then she'd apparently tripped and hit her head against a boulder. Falk and the others puffed up. Was it the artificial light of our torches, or did the inn owner turn a ghastly colour when he saw the sprawled body, his small eyes flicking around into the darkness uneasily? When I talked the gruesome scene over later with Peggy in our room, I found myself giving voice to the same sentiments that those of us in the darkness had buoyed our own spirits with, namely that this was the kind of accident that can, and unfortunately does happen, that there was nothing in it to suggest the supernatural. The tragedy was coincidental. Still, with the numbness of horror upon her, I could see Peggy's inquisitive mind working. She was that kind of girl, and I was hardly in a position to criticize. I've been called nosy, I hope in a good-natured way, before myself. There was talk among some of the guests of leaving the first thing in the morning. I thought of Mrs. Talmadge's worried, defeated face. "I'm not really scared, Johnny," Peggy whispered to me that night up in our room. "It's all kind of eerie, but, well, I'm not scared enough to ask you to take me away from here." I squeezed her hand. "If a ghost did this, I'd like to know," I put in jocularly. "And I'm so sorry for Mrs. Talmadge," Peggy went on. "I'll bet—" She stopped abruptly. "Bet what?" "It's nothing, really. I just had a sort of hunch." "I know better than to push her. so I subsided. The next day, the inn clientele was reduced by 5. There were 2 new arrivals, people who'd booked their reservations earlier, and out of respect to Mrs. Talmadge, very little mention was made of Miss Emmons' accident. A phlegmatic town marshal had come up, chewing at the end of a corncob pipe. He seemed bored by the whole procedure. After all, the deceased was one of them city folks that are always doing crazy things. So the episode was over. A fussy woman, a distant relative of Miss Emmons, had arrived and taken charge, and that was that. But there were still the groups of people talking quietly around Philip's Inn. The legend of the Indian ghost was obviously very prominent in their minds. It was prominent in my mind when, sometime after midnight the next night, I woke up to feel Peggy shaking me. "Johnny!" Her mouth was close to my ear, and I could smell the perfume of her. "Johnny, wake up!" I muttered that I was awake. "Then get up and come to the window with me." I swung bare feet out onto the floor and padded over to where Peggy crouched by the sill. Our window was at the back corner of the inn. We were high on the top floor, looking out over the glen and towards the falls. I looked. I saw nothing. My face must have been impatient. Anyway, Peggy grabbed my wrist. "Wait, wait," she hissed. "Maybe you'll see him." "See who?" Then there was a sound directly below us where a portion of the terrace ran. I switched my eyes downward, and from out of the shrubbery near the stone flags a shape emerged. In dark clothes it blended into the underbrush, but not before rays of moonlight had outlined the huge, heavy, familiar form. "Fork," I whispered. "But so what? He's got a right. It wasn't Fork I saw before, Johnny." My wife's fingers on mine felt cold. "I woke you up because I saw an Indian out there. So help me, I couldn't sleep and I was sitting here in the window. He looked like something out of another century. Darling, don't you think we ought to warn Mr. Fork?" "Warn him?" I harumphed. "He can take care of himself. We ought to warn the Indian." But some of the chill from Peggy's hand transferred itself to me. I made my decision quickly. "Look, hon, maybe we can get to the bottom of this right now. I'm going to sneak out and see what there is to see. I'm coming with you." "Peggy, don't be ridiculous. You don't want to go snooping around in the middle of the night. If you're going, I'm going." "No. Please, Johnny." "No." For a moment I thought the argument would keep up, but she subsided like a small, pouting child. I kissed her, slipped into a pair of sneakers, trousers, and shirt, put a flashlight in my pocket, and took a heavy walking stick as an afterthought. "You have all the fun," Peggy complained. "I'll be right back. I'm just going to stick my nose outside for a minute." I left her, crept down 3 carpeted flights, and made the terrace door. The wind rustled slightly, and the air smelled of night dampness and good clean outdoor things. I started across the grounds in the direction Fork had taken. I picked my way carefully, preferring the moonlight to my torch. I found the course I was following led directly to the path that paralleled the falls and climbed upward to the lakefront. Yes, here was a heavy footprint, the sort of footprint a man of Fork's size would make in the damp, soft ground. I couldn't be sure it was fresh, but I surmised as much, and it was worth the chance. I seemed to be on the right trail. Climbing the path gave me an unpleasant feeling. It was not much more than 24 hours since I and the others had hurried along this same way to find the broken body of Miss Emmons. It had been perfectly obvious from her face that the elderly spinster had been fleeing from something, and that something must have been very terrifying, for her expression was one of horror that even death could not relieve. Miss Emmons, in spite of her loquaciousness, was a woman, I should have judged, of more than average courage. Most of her ilk are, for the loneliness of their lives takes a kind of splendid courage to face, and yet she had fled screaming from something that had come at her from out of the blackness and wilds of the upper lake. I could imagine no tramp, no footpad frightening Miss Emmons to this extent that she would flee headlong and hysterical at her fastest pace along a dark and uneven trail. No, there was something else up there, and the only person that we knew had seen it was dead. 2. I reached the leveling out of the trail. The lake was a smooth, dark patch at my right. I chanced a couple of small pushes on my lamp. Yes, there were Falk's footprints. It must be he. I went on, occasionally flashing my torch. The wind was cool up here, blowing off the lake. I wished I'd thought to put on a sweater or a coat. There was no sound ahead of me, and I thought abruptly that this was probably a wild goose chase. The prints that resembled Falk's evidently were his, but hadn't they been made the earlier time we'd come up last night? I paused, undecided. There was a faint rustling ahead of me that alerted my senses, but the breeze was blowing a little harder now, playing with the brush and thickets around me. Still undecided, I half-turned, and as I did, as if to darkly forecast the future of my venture, the moon fled under a cloud. The sudden blackness caught me unawares. I tripped my flashlight again, found the path. I took the first step of my retreat. I took the second. And then, quickly, 2 things happened. The sound near me, I had thought the wind, came suddenly again, but even as I knew I'd been wrong in its diagnosis, a heavy blow caught me on the side of the head. In falling, I half-turned. I was still conscious, though sick, as I went down. I caught a fleeting glimpse of my assailant, good-sized, with the shining copper skin of an Indian warrior. Even as the muscled hand rose to deliver another blow with the stone-headed club, the painted face grinned hideously, and the 2 feathers in the headdress dipped in sardonic salute. The first blow had been a glancing one. Even though the second was more squarely struck, I had been able instinctively to roll my head and thereby take away some of the force. I was out for I don't know how long, but at least not for good. When I came to, I found myself lying on my side. I got up slowly, very carefully, as the memory of my attacker came back to me. Groping around on all fours, I finally found my flashlight, which had rolled into a thicket when I'd fallen. I fingered the side of my head ruefully, and then chanced a quick look around with the torch. Here was the path back to the inn, but my attention was caught by something on the outskirts of the little clearing in which I stood. It caught my attention like a waving flag. It was a piece of cloth hanging on a branch. The reason I jumped towards it, throwing caution to the winds, was because I recognized the unusual and colorful pattern of the square of tattered material. I should know. Peggy had had it made up specially for a skirt. This piece came from that. The yellow beam of my torch on the ground showed footprints, and feverishly I tried to differentiate between them. Here were my own. There, I surmised, perhaps the oblong impressions of a moccasin, made by the Indian, I guess. Then there were smaller prints, and my heart flopped in my throat. Darn little Peggy. I'd ordered her not to follow me, but she just couldn't resist pattering along behind, thinking how cute of her it was. And it was, except that this was no practical joke. We were fooling with something deadly, something that struck from out of the darkness with lightning suddenness. I was befuddled further when another set of tracks showed up, not far from R3. Then, with a start, I realized that they were the huge impressions of Falk. He'd been here, too. Perhaps he'd seen, perhaps he hadn't. Friend or foe, I knew not. Luckily, the earth was still damp from afternoon rain, and I followed the prints quite easily. The Indians were heavier, and even I, with my lack of experience in such matters, knew what that meant. The impression from Peggy's small feet had disappeared. The redskin was carrying her. I drove myself on, despite the fact that I was still dazed, and the pain from my bashed head was growing into a thundering pressure at my temple. I knew I was walking farther up into the upper lakeland than I'd ever gone before. And then, entirely by chance, I got a break. It was unlooked for and unintentional, but I'd had so many bad ones it was only right that something should go my way. The wind was blowing strongly towards me from straight ahead. In its natural sighs and rustles, I heard something else, a muttering that was fully human in origin. I moved forward, and the sound guided me to a higher promontory of land, looking directly down into a small clearing. The moon was low in the sky now, but there was enough light for me to see, and I realized quickly that only the direction of the wind had enabled me to find this place by the low gibberish that rose from the figure below. My straining eyes finally perceived another figure. This was smaller, propped up against a grey boulder, bound hand and foot. My Peggy! The moonlight touched softly against the bright patterns of her skirt. The Indian, and I recognized him as my assailant from earlier, was crouched before her, sitting cross-legged, waving his fists in the air, though praying to some unseen deity. He was as flesh and blood, as real as the lump on my temple. There was no legend, no ghost warrior about this one. The painted creature was making the aimless motions of some heathen pantomime. Even though I had nothing but my walking stick, action was imperative. I feared for Peggy. There was not a moment to lose. This creature, even though no ghost, was not entirely normal. I vaulted over the stone crag in front of me, leaping downward onto the lower land and running forward at the Indian. Twigs snapped and bushes rustled as I sprinted headlong. The savage turned, almost lazily. He rose from his crouching position, and one hand reached for the heavy club at his side. I do not know what the outcome of our struggle might have been. Suffice to say that I would have sold my life dearly with helpless little Peggy as the prize. But the contest never came off. When I was almost within grappling distance of the redskin, I saw something over his shoulder that seemed to stop the blood in my veins. It was a black apparition, and it rose from out of the forest, looming back of Peggy. I stopped abruptly, breath whistling through my open mouth. In the darkness I saw the glint of something, a long knife, and it was held dangerously near Peggy's neck. It was anticlimactic, perhaps, when a booming voice rang out, a voice no part of any supernatural vision. "Holland, stay where you are, or your wife dies." It was the heavy bass tones of Falk. I could see his face now, as he emerged even more from out of the shadows. He motioned for me to drop my cane, and as I did, the Indian was upon me, pinning my hands to my sides. But there was no heart in me left to struggle, not with that hunting knife so close to a precious white throat. With a quick wrench, the savage threw me to the ground, and then before I was able to overcome my apathy and shock, his quick hands had bound my wrists behind me with strong thongs. Falk came over then, still clutching the wicked-looking knife. "What's the meaning of this?" I asked indignantly. It is easy to be indignant, lying flat on one's back, but not so easy to sound so. The big, white, fleshy face leered down at me. "The meaning, Mr. Holland, is plain. You and your wife have stumbled on a matter that was none of your business. You've been too inquisitive for your own good." My cramped position didn't help me think. Still, I fired back. "You and this creature killed Miss Emmons." Falk shook his head. "Not exactly," replied the heavy man. "She had come across the breed here." Falk chuckled. "And I guess it gave her quite a turn. People her age shouldn't try to run so. No, that wasn't in the plans, Holland. She was just supposed to return and tell everybody she'd seen the ghost Indian." I nodded. I'd had something of a suspicion all along. "Just a frame, eh, Falk? I understand you're in line to buy Mrs. Talmadge out. If the price got low enough, you'd make a killing. After all, nobody's going to spend their yearly 2 weeks at a summer resort haunted by a bloodthirsty savage." "That's it," the big man admitted, with a sinister pleasantness. "You see, Holland, there is this legend. It's almost as old as the land around here. It may amuse a big brain like you, but local folks believe it, and the inn guests simply were non-committal until the skin made enough appearances. Then they got scared and left, and we saw to it they got scared, Holland. What do you want with my wife and me?" Falk didn't answer directly. He rolled his eyes upward at the dark heavens. "That's a pretty big investment. I don't know whether you know the inn business. We've got a good locality here. The only resort of its type in the state, as a matter of fact. Run the right way, this place could make plenty of money. Not a few measly thousands a year, but plenty. I've got ideas. Mrs. Talmadge never cared for them, but I'm going to be running things. See, I believe people like, well, let us say, games of chances, gambling and so forth. That spells revenue, Holland. I could make $1 million with this place in a few years if I was the sole owner, and I'm going to be. He paused ominously. What are you going to do with us? I wondered if I ought to just shut up. From within, a cold hand of dread was closing on my heart and throat. This man was completely ruthless, and he controlled the abnormal, wholly evil painted monstrosity that stood attentively at his elbow. Do? There's only one thing I can do. I'm sure it's evident to you, and I'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone, Holland, if you don't mind my putting it that way. He laughed, and the Indian's lips curled in a cruel smile, although I doubted if he followed the full conversation. Your destruction will further the Indian ghost legend to a degree that will kill off in business for the rest of the season. I know Mrs. Talmadge's financial setup. She'll have to sell out then. And it will also remove the only 2 people who, by accident or otherwise, have suspected that I was connected with this Indian. I'm hardly the man to wait for some legendary spectre to do my work for me. So I arranged for my own ghost, Holland. It's worked out very nicely. He wheeled, clapped his hands together, and made some motions to the Indian. I was jerked to my feet. Meanwhile, Falk turned to Peggy, pulling her upright too. He took the gag from her mouth. Of course, there is no use screaming from up here. You're miles from the inn, and no one would dare come here, even in daylight, much less the dead of night, except ourselves. They led us, the Indian in front, Peggy and I bumping together to be as close as possible, though our hands were tied behind our backs, Falk bringing up the rear. Sometimes I wondered how the way was discernible, but the half-breed had the cunning of his race, and we picked our way through what seemed to me like impenetrable forest land. Finally, through the trees ahead, I could see we were approaching the lake. As we came out on the shore, I turned and saw the fear deep within Peggy's eyes, but her chin was firm, and she gave me a reassuring bump with her shoulder that said, "Don't worry about me, Johnny." I think I've read that you talk with the villain. You talk for time, and they're usually voluble, wanting to explain how smart they are. Falk violated these principles. He was taciturn, concentrating on the business at hand. I did find out that the skin had spotted me on Falk's trail, and they'd both doubled back to get me. Then, just after I'd been knocked out, Peggy came blundering along, flashlight burning for the whole forest to see. Falk couldn't be sure she hadn't seen him and the varmint attacking me, so they took her off just to make sure. At least I was relieved to know that the redskin I'd spotted that night several days earlier was not the result of over-imagination and too much liquor, but was our two-feathered friend, the feeble-minded half-breed. Peggy and I were pushed unceremoniously down onto our backs. I saw her wince with pain as her hands were cut by a rock onto which the Indian shoved her. Angry words came to my throat, but I choked them off. It wouldn't help her, and it wouldn't help me. Falk stood before me, his mountainous form silhouetted against the lake that stretched out before us. He cleared his throat, and then he mopped his face. He had something to say, I could see. The half-witted Indian stood behind him, nervous with pleasant anticipation. Falk, I recall, was almost apologetic. He gave a little bow. You'll think it's silly of me, but this part I don't exactly relish. Of course, it's got to be done, but you'll excuse me. You see, he said it with a half-smile that I shall always remember. I've never seen two people scalped. He mopped his face again and backed away from us, looking as though he were imagining the whole thing. We will then put you in a canoe, tow you out into the middle of the lake, and head you down toward the falls. They'll find you tomorrow morning, but—" The big man raised a hand. "Don't be disturbed about that part of it, because you won't be aware of the unpleasant sensation of going over the falls, and you may count on me, Mr. Holland. I will see that you and your wife are placed close together in the canoe. Your bodies, I mean." Again, almost apologetically, he bowed to us, turned to the Indian with a gesture, and then moved off a ways into the underbrush. The half-breed came closer, and I saw him pick up the huge hunting knife Fork had had earlier. It was very big, very sharp, I guessed. I made motions and noises on the ground. It's almost impossible to get up when your hands are tied behind you, though. My struggling was futile. I did manage to croak, "Me first, me first," and the Indian, with that strange, demented half-smile, made the concession. He squatted beside me and reached tentatively forward to place a heavy hand on my head. I noticed the pattern of paint on his face, and I could smell the animal odor of his body so close. I dared not look at Peggy. I wondered, strangely, if when an Indian scalps you, he starts at the back and comes forward, or... Then there was a sound. I don't think I would have heard it, except that my senses in this last moment were so acutely tuned that the noise of an acorn dropping many yards away would be like a heavy thump. The sound I heard came from out on the lake, and it was high-pitched, almost beyond the audible range of man's hearing. It was a mournful, lost soul sound. They say jackals at night on the plains make that sort of noise. I thought it was my eager imagination that made the sound seem both louder and nearer. The look of intense listening on my face must have caught the breed's attention. He turned his head, and I saw my chance. I aimed a kick at his leg with one foot and attempted to hook the other back of his ankle and so pull myself erect, but the redskin, with primitive cunning, had anticipated even that. As he turned to look questioningly out across the dark lake, he had stepped back quickly from my side, just enough to throw off my aim. My kick spent itself in empty air, and the grinning savage, immensely pleased at my attempt, which he seemed to have expected, bent again at my side, this time his hand on my head cruelly tight, with a fistful of hair. I watched his right hand fascinated, the brown knuckles tight over the handle of the long knife, the flexible wrist moving it slightly upward. I heard, as though from far away, Peggy's sudden cries. I tried to turn my head to look at her, for a last time, but the Indian's left hand held me tight, his mouth opened slightly, showing yellow, snaggled teeth. And then, very slowly, he extended the knife. I was wrong, I thought, with the attention to little things that so often typifies a moment of supreme horror like this. He would start not from the back or the front, but from the side. And then, as the skin of my cranium tingled to feel the first sweet sharp pain of the knife blade, there was another sound from the lake, a faint swishing, much nearer, and then a muted twang. Events happened too fast then for my shocked brain. There was an unhealthy plopping sound, and suddenly through the Indian's middle appeared a driven shaft, the point almost touching my body, its force spent in the redskins. The half-breed screamed and surged to his feet. He took hold of the arrow, his hands wrenching at the feathered shaft in his back. He pulled in a mad ecstasy of pain, and I saw the weapon come loose out of the ugly, red, gushing hole in his side. He flung it to the ground and faced lakeward, all the time screaming horribly through pain-contorted lips. Then little Peggy was on me, fumbling at the thongs around my wrists, crying and whimpering that she'd sawed through her fastenings on the rock. In a moment I was free. Behind us I heard the crashing of Fork approaching through the bushes. Despite my repugnance for the thing, I seized the long sharp arrow the breed had torn from his side. It was a better weapon than none. The hunting knife was too far away. The Indian had sunk to his knees, blood pouring from his side. Fumbling and falling, warding off the bushes with one arm, my other around Peggy's waist, I pulled her into the merciful darkness of the forest. We ran as in some obscene, fevered nightmare, and as we ran, those calls and yells and screams behind us became dimmer. First Fork had been screaming my name in furious frustration. I could hear him as he drove his elephantine body around in circles looking for us. Then the high sighing sound from the lake had come closer, and folks' cries became those of someone in supreme terror. We made the inn somehow, some way. It was still dark, and we gained our room unseen, to lie panting on the bed, shoulder to shoulder. I comforted Peggy as best I could, took a stiff shot of whiskey myself. I put the arrow I'd snatched up as a weapon in the corner, hiding it from Peggy's eyes with the window screen. The next day we agreed mutually to remain silent for a time. The inn was buzzing with Mr. Fawkes' disappearance. 2 days later, a party of deputies searching upland found an outrageous thing. The marshal finally explained it on the grounds of irresponsible campers who had improperly extinguished their cooking fires in the woods. He would say little more. I got the story direct from one of the deputies, a young chap who dabbled in brass by driving a taxi. "It was terrible, Mr. Holland," he told me. "These two tied to stakes they must have been, and the flesh burned right off them. Why, there wasn't much more left than blackened bone. I don't know who the other poor devil was, but one was this here Fawke. We found some identification. Burned at the stake they was." The case ended there. The marshal was happy to find any halfway reasonable explanation for a most unreasonable occurrence. He was largely interested, this season anyway, in the vagaries of outdoor campers from the city, as he liked to put it, who refused to observe proper forestry precautions. I never told Peggy about the arrow. You see, when we returned to the city, I paid a visit to a very old friend of mine, whose knowledge is even greater than his years. As the curator of the State Natural History Museum and a leading ethnologist, I asked his opinion of the arrow which I brought him, which I had carefully put away since the night I'd hidden it in the corner of our inn-room. Old Mr. Belknap, the curator, took it from my hands, seeming to weigh it in his worn, gnarled ones. My eyes questioned him as he looked at the feathered butt, the shaft, and the arrowhead. "Remarkable," he murmured. I asked him just what was remarkable. "Young man," he replied, "you should read Morgan or Schoolcraft, or perhaps a treatise on the part the sorrel tree played in the making of arrows." His eyes twinkled through ancient horn-rimmed spectacles. "Where did you get this?" he asked, when the humor of the situation had worn itself out in the dusty museum room. I made up a vague, spur-of-the-moment tale which satisfied me as little as it apparently did Belknap. "Can you tell me anything about it?" I pushed. "I can tell you all about it," he replied. "It's a find, Holland. Centuries old, I'd swear. From its markings, the type used by one of the Iroquois tribes, possibly the Mohawks." "Centuries old?" I repeated. "You're sure?" "Yes," he answered, wagging his full-of-knowledge head. "I'm sure." His faded eyes peered at me, seeming to say, "What are you going to do with it?" The questions in my mind had been answered. I exhaled and made the gesture he had been hoping for. I made Belknap and his museum a present of the weapon. After all, a genuine Mohawk arrow of centuries ago in a near-perfect state of preservation is a rare collector's item, and I am no collector. I'm sure the curator noticed the this century dried blood on the shaft as he handled the precious arrow, but he asked no more questions, just scuttled off after a profound nod of thanks into the dark back regions of the museum, with his prize held in his hands. As I said, Curator Belknap is a very wise old man.
If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, and further information relating to our releases on Audible iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,